So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio.
Join the conversation today. The number's 1-888-914-9149. I'm Timmery. I have a question. We'll be talking about this a little later on. What will set us apart as Christians? We're seeing this increase in death among young people, especially the age about 25 to 34. And it's a trend that we're seeing across the board. We had been seeing a rise in life expectancy, but the last few years haven't shown those same trends in terms of people continuing to live longer lives. And so how can we approach this as Catholics to show a good witness in the culture? We'll be talking about that. If you have any thoughts, go ahead and give us a call at 1-888-914-9149. Also joining me today will be Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparro, joining us every Wednesday. And we'll be talking about Pride Month in two trends right now that we're seeing. One, Harry Potter author JK Rowling is creating quite the buzz on social media right now, specifically Twitter, for things that she said surrounding sexuality and the transgender movement since December. We'll also be talking about how many parents are starting to feel pressure that they need to teach their children how to celebrate Pride Month and really celebrate and support the LGBTQ types of lifestyles. Now, there's an article that I was reading, and I think that they have some really good points that we can take from to help shape the conversation and be prepared when those difficult conversations come up with young ones who are actually being exposed to this issue at a very, very young age. Now, in the midst of the coronavirus craze, the first thing that stood out to me before we even knew that the coronavirus was hitting the United States was when we were looking at what was happening in China and people started to become a little afraid. And in the midst of that fear, there were a lot of jokes made about the coronavirus. You may remember back in February, most of the American conversation about the coronavirus actually was the form of memes, and people were laughing about it. And I found it very interesting because a lot of Catholics just kind of felt a little uncomfortable with the joke. And Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparro, who will be joining me in a little bit, commented that often when people are afraid, they make light of things, and they turn something into a joke. I thought that was interesting because I want to shape today's conversation surrounding a quote I read this morning from St. Teresa of Avila. She is a saint who lived in Avila, Spain in the 16th century. And she wrote in The Way of Perfection talking about how we no longer desire death. In fact, in many ways, we could say that we fear and abhor it in our culture. And I think that this is part of the reason so many people were willing to be quite compliant as restrictions very rapidly were implemented across the nation surrounding trying to protect us from death. Many people were concerned that they could be within that percentage group of people who were high risk of contracting coronavirus and that it could be fatal for them. Now, what was interesting to me all along before it even made it to the United States, that is to our knowledge, was that people were so afraid of dying. And as I read this quote from St. Teresa of Avila, I notice that we have two general attitudes in our secular culture about death that have even entered their way into Catholic Christianity. Now, St. Teresa of Avila commented that nowadays many people are not tired of living even at 100 years old, but they always want to live longer. She also said that our lives are not so difficult for us that we do not suffer such trials or poverty that Jesus had to bear. She was commenting on the fact that Jesus was eager to return to the kingdom of heaven in heaven with God himself, the Heavenly Father. She refers to this as Jesus talks about celebrating the Paschal Supper, the last meal he will celebrate with his dear friends on earth before his crucifixion. And she talks about this eagerness ultimately to enter into that death and to be united yet again with God the Father. And I find it interesting because Growing up a cradle Catholic, I was taught really good attitudes with regard to death, that death is actually a good thing and the right timing. Not that we get to choose our timing, but the timing is right when our souls are prepared at any moment for death. Yet that's not the cultural attitude that is prevalent today. I would say there are two main attitudes. One is that we avoid death at all costs and desire to live longer. And two, we almost try to seek a way out of life through death, but through this attitude surrounding suicide, we actually do it at the same time trying to avoid God in a sense. It's kind of this final act of absolute separation and agony from God. That this is where we're at in our culture. And the two are both rather dark. One says, I don't need God and I don't want to be with him. And the other says, I do not know where he is, and so I'm despairing and I'm ending my life now. Yet that's not the Catholic attitude we are called to have. The Catholic approach to death is that, one, we actually anticipate our death. And because of that, we are always prepared for it. Now, this is why Catholics have been so upset about being separated from Jesus Christ in the sacraments, from reconciliation and communion, because we're struggling to understand how do we stay in that state of grace without the sacraments. The battle has been real over these past few months. I've commented multiple times over the last few weeks. I've never worked in the pro-life movement or evangelization in the last 10 years of my life without having access to daily mass and regular confession. It's been difficult. Little bad habits have gotten worse. Feeling maybe a little bit of that frustration and maybe not quite despair, but negativity has been really easy when we've been separated from our Lord Jesus Christ, when we've not been reunited to him after the darkness that we can participate in. That is our own sin. So I want to talk about an approach that the church has held with regard to death. That approach is Memento Mori. It's an attitude that we are always to remember our death. And we've seen this resurgence of Memento Mori, preparation for death, in the last few years in the Catholic tradition. There's this quote that I pull from St. Alphonsus Liguori's book, Preparation for Death, where he talked about this skull in an image, and I actually believe it comes from a painting. And on the image it says of the skull, "What you are, I once was, and what I am, you will become." It's a reminder that death is inevitable. Let me say that again. What you are, I once was, and what I am, you will become. Now, there's been this approach for many of the saints, and even to this day, many of our religious, to have a skull present, say, on your desk. And it's a reminder to always be prepared to die. It's a reminder that death is inevitable, and we take nothing in this world with us to the grave. One of my favorite books that I've read in the last 5 years has been St. Alphonsus Liguori's book, Preparation for Death. Now, I find it fascinating because here's a saint who lived in the 17th century Spain. He actually lived in Italy. And St. Alphonsus Liguori had this deep understanding of the moral and ethical reality of what the human person is called to participate in. And that ultimately, death is an outlook that we should have as Christians in the culture. And to bring this full circle, I was thinking about this in relation today to the Mass reading, the first reading, about the battle between the prophets of Baal and Elijah that we read about in 1 Kings chapter 18. If you're just joining us, you're listening to Trending with Timmery. If you'd like to weigh in on the conversation, the number is 1-888-914-9149. Now, in this battle between the prophets of Baal and Elijah in 1 Kings 18, we see there's a test of the gods going on between the quote-unquote god of Baal, which is essentially a representation of the devil and the demons, and between the God of Israel. And it's fascinating because Elijah challenges them. He throws down the gauntlet and he says, okay, let's test our gods. He says, let's go ahead and take these bowls, and you ignite this bowl with fire, this oblation, this offering to God, by calling upon your God to bring fire down upon this bowl and to accept this as a sacrifice. And so all day long, the prophets of Baal are trying to get this bowl to be consumed with fire by their God. And they even do things such as cutting themselves and abusing themselves in order to try and make it happen. And alas, it doesn't. And then Elijah says, okay, here's my sacrifice. I want you to go ahead and soak it in water. I want you to build a trench around it. And I want you now to really see how wet this is. And now my God, and he invokes God, and God consumes not only the sacrifice, but he consumes the water surrounding the sacrifice. So my question is, what are you and I turning to? Are we turning to false gods to answer our prayers? To answer everything we're seeking after? Are we looking to that new great thing to help us live longer? Are we looking to that way out of our present suffering, perhaps by contemplating suicide? You see, we are living in the midst of the same drama that the prophets of Baal and Elijah experienced. And ultimately, Elijah is challenging you and I to take up a greater level of faith in our Lord Jesus Christ. And so I challenge you to remember this in the midst of fear and anxiety and animosity in our culture, to have a better attitude about death. And to remember that this is part of what sets us apart as Catholics. We'll talk a little bit more about what can set us apart as Catholics later on the show. Joining me is Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparro. Michael Gasparro works with Healing and Peace Catholic Ministries. It can be found at healingandpeace.com. Thanks for joining us every Wednesday here, Michael.
Yeah, great to talk with you again, Tim-Marie.
Michael, we are in June already. It's so surprising. The last few months have gone by so rapidly. And with June comes the regular public, and now maybe even more so, social media celebration of Pride Month. I remember growing up in Southern California, my first exposure to Pride Month was that Disneyland would highly celebrate Pride Day and week at the time. And it was horrible when you made the kind of mistake of going there as a kid or as a family, and here is being celebrated at what is called the most happiest place on earth, Pride Month. Now, it's interesting that that was always a target location, specifically Disneyland, for celebrating the various lifestyles of the LGBTQ community. But what kind of stands out to me, Michael, is the fact that at the heart of this whole Pride Month has continued to be exposure that young children receive to the topic. So I'd love to talk with you a little bit further about that and how you see this is and is not common in the current culture.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is, have you ever been to the Grove in Los Angeles, Tim-Marie?
Yes.
So last year, I remember going to the Grove, and I just actually want to preface this first by saying you and I have had a lot of conversations on the radio show over the last year about LGBTQ issues, and I want to preface this by saying that we are not here to propagate a hateful agenda towards people who identify as part of that community. And we want to really emphasize that we see the dignity of every human being in that community as equal to anyone not in that community. But because of that, we don't see them reduced simply to that label either. And so any of these conversations that we have, I just want to put that out there from the gate, just out of the gate. And it's good because it gets, sometimes there has been healthy backlash against parts of the church, especially in the United States, maybe not even always the Catholic Church, but certain Protestant churches that talk about this in a very unloving way. So we can help right that course a bit by how you and I have had these conversations. I feel like we do a good job of that, but I want to let your listeners know that we're not here to vilify people, but we're not here to also turn a blind eye to the realities of a culture war, let's say. And at the Grove, for instance, I went last year, Timmery, and it was like rainbows had vomited over the entire place. And it was the most obvious virtue signaling I've seen in a long time. I don't think for a second that a lot of these companies really care that much about the message they're pushing. I think it's far more an opportunity that if you don't do this, you might be looked at as not supportive of the LGBTQ causes. And it's really being forced, like you said, on children especially, in a way that's not fair or reasonable and doesn't take into consideration normal developmental processes. Psychosexual self-development is often latent, as many early psychoanalysts would say, between the ages of 5 or 6 years old and 11 or 12. And yet here we are sexualizing and pushing sexual identities and agendas on elementary children who don't even know what sex is. And Pride Month does this in an absurd way by conflating the rainbow flag with all things love. And love is, as you and I both know, more than a feeling, more than a sexual desire. It's a choice. It's willing the good of the other. Where does that exist for us as Christians? And where does it exist in this discussion? And I don't think it's being addressed nearly enough.
And Michael, it's fascinating to me because you talk about this vomiting of rainbow, which is so unfortunate. We could talk about the biblical roots and the sign that it means for us, but the rainbow and unicorns are some of the most popular kids' toys right now. I'm sometimes shocked when I see, a friend whose kid has a unicorn, yet those unicorns are animals that are being pushed through an agenda to talk about the uniqueness and individuality of who you are, and it's feeding an attitude, unfortunately in the wrong way, about individuality in terms of self-determination and self-definition with regard to gender among kids from a very, very early age.
Yeah, it's so confusing. I mean, to me, it's confusing as an adult sometimes. I'm a 33-year-old man, and I'm confused by some of the messaging. I mean, and I'm sorry, I'm not limited in my ability to have deep conversations around sexual politics. And yet, if I'm still struggling with graduate education in psychology to discuss the complexities of the gender arguments that are being made, how are we expecting 6-year-old children to make sense of this? It's nonsense. There is objective reality in the world, and that objective reality is that we are male and female, like we believe as Christians. God created them male and female. If we fail to enact that kind of clarity when we talk about this with children, we are doing them a disservice. It doesn't mean we don't have compassion and sensitivity for people that have difficulty or disorders of sexual development or identity, but we should not abandon a loving and clear and truthful perspective when we're speaking with vulnerable young minds about these very important topics.
One Catholic celebrity that was receiving a lot of recognition for a while, and I've seen some of that kind of tampered down a little bit, is comedian Jim Gaffigan. And all of a sudden, a few years ago, as he's receiving a lot of attention from the Catholic community, he suddenly comes out and posts on Instagram an image of himself and some of his children at a gay pride parade during Pride Month. Now, I thought that this was interesting because many people were touting, here's a great example of a Catholic. And it's hard because I think a lot of good-willed people are trying to do the best they can with regard to the LGBTQ issues. But often, as you said, it can turn into virtue signaling. And there's a huge difference in our culture between having empathy for something that may be going on, having empathy for a person, empathy for an action, and approving an action. And so I want to talk about that in relation to this article that you sent over in the Washington Post that's titled Being Straight Allies, essentially, or has to do with being straight allies. It's by Bonnie J. Ruff, and she essentially is trying to talk about how she realized when talking to some friends at a event for fundraising surrounding plants, which is funny. I like how our fundraisers used to be candy bars and now it's plants. Anyways, she was talking about how she heard another parent describe Pride Month as a huge opportunity for their families to really consider and teach their kids about being an ally for Pride in June. And so there were some points that she brought up in the article to help give parents tips for how to do this that really stood out to me, Michael. First and foremost is that this tip of, we need to recognize that Pride Month is a celebration in honor of LGBTQ struggles. And so we need to not only teach that it's a celebration to the kids, but we need to honor the struggles that the community have been through, both old and new. And I thought this was interesting because just like some of the racism issues, we're putting a lot of these topics on kids that are very heavy that I believe can create too much pressure for a child at too soon of an age. What are your thoughts?
Whenever I was 7 or 8 years old, I think if somebody tried to explain to me the Stonewall riots, it would have probably been a harmful and confusing experience. I think as Catholics, we can do two things. We can hold space for people who have had wrong done to them, perhaps people who were marginalized by society. There are a lot of complex, nuanced angles to how we treat people who identify as male, if maybe they're female, or vice versa, or people who identify as gay or a part of the LGBT community, a self-identified part of that community. And no one, I don't know any Catholic, personally at least, that openly says, yeah, we should encourage the government to harass physically or otherwise people of those communities. That is not the same as using this as a chance to indoctrinate children about what those communities stand for. And if it were just about telling younger people at an age-appropriate level about certain bad things that happen to a part of the LGBT community, that'd be one thing. But that's not what these articles advocate. They advocate for indoctrinating what these communities stand for ideologically. She goes on in that article to say, bring your child to a drag queen story hour. Timmerie, I know men who have dressed up as what they call, in quotes, drag queens. I have love for these people. If one more person tells me, if you just meet somebody that's been there, I know people. I've been close friends with people who have struggled with this.
Friends, family members.
Yes. And I know that those individuals would probably even agree with me at times that drag queens are adult cabaret performers targeting a very provocative and sexualized entertainment niche. It's not for children. That doesn't make any sense. So this is nonsense. And they're conflating the idea of pushing acceptance and love of a person with an acceptance and love of an ideology. And we should push back against that with love.
That's Michael Gasparro. He's an associate marriage and family therapist. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. If you have a question, go ahead and give Michael and I a call at 1-888-914-9149. We'll be talking about JK Rowling's comments and Twitter storm surrounding some of her comments surrounding transgender ideology. Now, Michael, there are two more points that I want to continue to bring up here in this article. The author talks about how we need to teach kids the ABCs, essentially, or now they call it the gay BCs, to make sure they're comfortable using terms associated with the LGBT community. Now, I don't agree with her idea that they need to be comfortable using these terms, but I do think that we need to explain what some of these confusing terms are at an age that is appropriate, more so for ourselves as an adult. I have to look up a new term all the time, like what is cisgender? That's someone who identifies with their biological sex. Yet there's pressure on children to come out as cisgender now. And so we need to understand the language they're using so that we can address the arguments they're making.
Yeah, keep your friends closer and your enemies closer. I mean, not that these people are all our enemies, but we have to know and understand the inner workings of the ideology. And for everyone to be very clear, Pope Francis has spoken extensively on this. Pope Benedict XVI, Emeritus Benedict XVI did as well. In gender ideology, Pope Francis specifically called, and I believe I'm quoting him, ideological colonization. And that Pope Benedict, he echoed his sentiments, said that we're in the age of sin against God, the Creator, for this reason. So I'm not saying that every Catholic should know everything our Holy Father has ever said about this issue, but if you are someone who, as a faithful Catholic, is interested in the leadership of our church, they have not been silent. And so arm yourself with awareness of what the church has said. We are not morally neutral on this issue as Catholics. Let me say that again for your audience to hear. We are not morally neutral on this. This is not laissez-faire c'est la vie, so goes life. This is serious, and the church has echoed that over and over again. And you can defend this. I want to encourage your listeners. You can defend the truth on this matter with love. Look in the eyes of someone who disagrees with you and see Christ in them, but do not back down from the truth.
That's Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparro. We'll be right back here on Trending with Timmerie.
We're talking about what you're thinking about. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
What's trending in your life? Give us a call. The number's 1-888-914-9149. JK Rowling is hitting the world by storm right now with her tweets and now essay, as she not just doubles down but triples down with regard to her position on transgenderism. She's clearly opposed to this experimentation on children surrounding sexuality, and it's fascinating to see some of her comments. With me today is Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparro, who's doing great work with Healing and Peace Catholic Ministries. Now, Michael, it's fascinating because back in December, JK Rowling ended up taking the internet by storm when she ended up commenting about a friend of hers, Maya Forstater, who is a researcher who lost her job at a think tank for stating that people cannot change their biological sex. Now, since that, Rowling has commented a number of times about how someone can't change their biological sex. While she may be pro the movement of same-sex attraction and so forth and living a gay lifestyle, she's not buying this transgender movement, especially as it impacts children. I would love to hear your thoughts on what the latest update is in her essay that just came out a few hours ago.
The first thing that came to mind was her tweet that started the controversy a couple days ago, Timmerie. You know, the one where she said, people who menstruate. I think there was a word for that before. What was it? Wumpund, wimpund. And then she finally was alluding to the word woman. And so, in her typical form, she uses clever humor to try to draw an eye to the hypocrisy of something. And she's saying by eliminating even the use of the word woman, you're eliminating a woman's experience. Of course, women are the ones who menstruate. We know this. This is biological, normal. Of course, there are disorders of that development, but we don't need to get lost in the weeds there. So my first reaction is good for her. I still have some concerns. She's very libertarian, Timmerie, on trans individuals as adults making their own choices about their bodies. So she supports, even in her own essay, she supports trans people making movements towards their whatever surgeries they want, etc. Her biggest issues are them eliminating the reality of biological sex and saying they're not women. They can call themselves trans women, but they're not women. And the big thing in the essay that's a takeaway for me is she doubles down on this issue affecting females. She quotes that there's been around a 4,400% increase of biological female to male trans populace in, I believe, the UK, but even possibly larger than that, in the last, let's say, decade or so. You can look at the figures in her essay. And her point is, this movement is actually impacting females at a level and a rate that is more than even biological males. So her concern is from the angle as a person who is a feminist, which is such an interesting twist on this whole trans controversy.
And it's so interesting because it is a good point. As someone who is a self-proclaimed feminist, that is JK Rowling, she's being called many names right now, one of which is apparently very derogatory. So if anyone's offended that I say this on air, I'm sorry, but TERF. And TERF stands for, it's actually really interesting, it's an acronym for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. So someone who's still a feminist, but they exclude the trans community from being a part of feminism, which is fascinating to me, Michael, because third wave feminism, modern pop feminism, is pro-equality, absolutely whatever goes. Who are you to say that, a dog is different from a human? Who are you to say, it's crazy. It's absolutely insane. And who are you to say that there's any difference between male and female? Who are you to say that a 7-year-old can't get a sex change if he wants to? And so as she's doubling down, she's citing medical and scientific data that is emphasizing that, in fact, science is actually pretty clear on this topic. And so as people are saying to Rowling right now that others who basically, if you go against the medical community today, you're just getting your facts wrong. That's not what science and academia and endocrinologists and many other people, and we'll talk about that in a minute, are saying with regard to the transgender issue. But before we go there, Michael, we have a caller. Ooh, and I think that she just dropped. But really quick, I would love comments from you. She had commented that her son recently came out as gay, and she said half the family is supportive and half isn't. She said there's a lot of chaos in her family right now. She doesn't know how to handle it in the midst of all of this division they're experiencing. Do you have just a couple words of insight to help this situation, Michael?
Sure. Well, and as somebody that I have personally experienced same-sex attraction, and that's part of my story and my testimony, which you and I will have to talk about sometime soon on the show, but as somebody who's striving to try as best I can by God's grace to live according to the church teachings while having the struggle myself of having same-sex attraction, I think it's important for people to remember that support looks a lot of different ways. So when she says half the family supportive and half isn't, that's already kind of a little yellow flag to me to reflect as a community on what does it mean to support somebody. Sometimes support can mean showing concern for them about their life choices. So I would encourage families when this happens to stay in loving connection with their children, to stay attuned to them, listen, hear their story, but also don't be afraid to ask good questions. And remember that some people maybe need to be supported to live the church teachings, not just to embrace a gay identity, and to be sensitive to those people as well.
That's excellent. And Michael, kind of words, from your experience as well, which we'll talk about at a later date as well. Put yourself in these shoes. Here you are, you've come out to a parent, you're talking about your struggles. What did you need to hear from a parent in this situation?
Well, I think more than kids needing to hear personally that their parents approve of everything they do, I think kids need to hear, we love you no matter what. Mm-hmm. And so loving someone no matter what is very different than loving everything they do. And in fact, if you say you love everything they do, you're probably lying no matter what the topic is. So sexuality or not, you're not going to love everything your kid do, and you're not going to love them in spite of everything they do. You're going to love them fully 100% like God loves them as best you can. So this is very important to delineate between, am I just talking about their behaviors or am I talking about their identity? And our identity is as beloved children of God in Christ Jesus. And how can we see that dignity in our children and show them that regardless of whatever they tell us about their sexuality or the questions they have? That's what I think I needed, and I think what a lot of young people need is, I love you no matter what. I'm here for you no matter what.
That's Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparro joining us here every Wednesday with his keen insights into some of the toughest topics of our day. If you'd like to weigh in on the conversation ever, or want to hear us discuss a topic with Michael, please feel free to reach out at relevantradio.com/trending. You can send us an email or a message on social media. Michael, this question brought to mind a really important point about how we're celebrating Pride Month right now. Not that we are celebrating it, but how to maybe acknowledge what is happening in the culture. That this is a real struggle that a handful of our friends, family members, and strangers really are encountering with regard to same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria. So what's really helpful, I think, Michael, is, like you continue to mention every time you join us, is to see these individuals as people and not reduce them to their sexuality the way that mainstream media, television, and movies show and portray through the insistence of various organizations that insist that there are representations of LGBTQ people in their shows, yet when those people have speaking parts, they only talk about their sexual identity, their sexual intimacy, and have extreme displays of PDA. Yet that's not what you and I or any Christian should be doing. We should be lifting them up apart from their sexuality and showing that unconditional love that you've been talking about.
unconditional love can involve also asking why. Why does somebody have this experience? Why are they the way they are? And what do they really need? And if our belief as Catholics is that there's a natural moral law, that law leads towards human flourishing. So we should not be ashamed of our teachings. We should try to introspect, where is the joy and the freedom and the truth in our church's teachings? Even if it's a road that's marked with some suffering, where is it leading people? And I would argue that the closer we align ourselves with that law, even myself saying that I openly am not perfect, no one is, but we strive for that by God's grace. And when we cooperate first with God's grace, then we lead ourselves more to joy and freedom. And we got to get better about talking about that. When joy should be our intro here, not just restriction. We're trying to help people find that peace of Christ.
And we'll actually be talking about that in just a little bit. What sets us apart as Christians, and how can we approach our life in a way that is infectious, attractive to other people? Michael, I want to bring the conversation back to JK Rowling as she's taking the internet by storm with her tweeting and now essay that was just released today. She's being accused of distorting facts and not using real facts with regard to transgenderism. But let's just mention a few things here. We have major warnings in our culture from endocrinologists who are saying the research on hormone therapy, hormone replacement for people who want to identify as the opposite sex of what they are biologically, from what we see, is not good, is not healthy, is not safe, but we also don't know fully the long-term ramifications. And so endocrinologists are speaking out against it. We're hearing warnings from pediatricians worldwide calling sex changes, both physical surgeries and manipulation with hormones, child abuse. And we're even hearing warnings from plastic surgeons who are saying this is a physical manipulation of the body that is damaging, painful, and irreversible. Michael, can you speak a little bit more to the true story, both medical and psychological facts of this issue?
Well, what was so great about JK Rowling's essay that came out today, which I encourage people to read, it doesn't mean that I agree with everything she wrote in it, but there were some really interesting points. Timmery, you would love to hear that she cites her research into funding multiple sclerosis research and the endocrinologist's perspective as part of her concern, because this disease impacts men and women, biological men and women, differently. So she said, I'm invested in this because I care about women's health. And she goes on to say that she's concerned about, and I love this.
Ooh, Michael, are you there? I think you went out for a second. We'll grab you real quick to get that point. I think we're just having to reconnect with his audio, but we'll touch back on this last point that he was mentioning with regard to JK Rowling. You're listening to Trending with Timmery. Again, if you want to weigh in on the conversation, perhaps you have a topic that you would really appreciate hearing Michael discuss. He's with us every Wednesday here on Trending with Timmery, heard on Relevant Radio, and he's approaching some of the most difficult topics of our culture, both from a professional perspective as a marriage and family therapist, but also from his experience as well at having experienced same-sex attraction. And so he's able to give us a keen insight into this topic as a faithful Catholic. Michael, I think you're back on the line. You broke up just a little bit there. If you could pick up and continuing to explain to us some of what JK Rowling has said on this topic.
Where'd you lose me, Timmery, so I know where we left off?
You were explaining how she has advocated, JK Rowling has advocated really to kind of understand the impact on women and kind of where she's donated and supported as well.
Yeah, and she even doubles down so far as to say that she might have questioned her own gender identity if the messaging had been this confusing when she was a child. And highlights the safety of women as her main concern. Changing room, bathrooms, where women should be protected and allowed to have safeguards to be, especially young women, free from having biological males enter at their will based on how they describe their gender identity. And these are things I never thought I would hear a public author like JK Rowling address. So this is a cultural moment that we should hopefully see other people grab onto and start to at least question the narrative.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today, Michael. And we'll be sure to post a link to JK Rowling's essay that she released today on my Twitter. Just head over to relevantradio.com/trending, and you can go ahead and connect on Twitter to view that essay. We'll be right back here on Relevant Radio. That was marriage and family therapist Michael Gasparro. Find him at healingandpeace.com.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Join the conversation. The number's 1-888-914-9149. What will set us apart as Christians in this current culture? How can we approach our health, our happiness in a way that models it for other people in society? I think this is really important because we as Christians should be living a lifestyle that is attractive, infectious. And I think this is important, and the reason why I'm thinking about this is we were talking about death earlier and the approach and fear surrounding death because of the coronavirus, and just even before the coronavirus. Notice every story for years now always has something to do with the undead and being resurrected. It shows there's a lot of fear about death. And there's also a lot of anxiety about living as well, and many people are despairing in the midst of life. I'm looking at this article that says that Americans are dying young at alarming rates. Over the last 3 years, there's been this decline in life expectancy, which is a complete reversal of historical patterns that we've been setting. Between 2010 and 2017, there's essentially been this 30% jump in deaths among people in that age range between 25 and 34. Now, some people ask, well, what are some of the causes? We see on the surface, many of us can guess, the opioid crisis, also obesity, and women dying of diseases that are common to men, such as suicide and liver disease. Now, I thought the last one was a little more interesting because when we talk about women dying of diseases that weren't common to women, it's fascinating. Suicide is a more violent act that tends to be done more so predominantly among men. Now, yet in cultures we're seeing worldwide, there's been this spike in women. In fact, in China, women are committing suicide at a rate of 500 women per day. It's the only place in the world where we see more women than men committing suicide. They live in a godless nation enforced by the government, and they also live in a nation that is taking away fundamental elements of femininity in the culture by forced abortion and sterilization of their women and the destruction of the lives of their children, and at times the outright removal of their living children from their dwelling. And so I think that we see a hint into the culture. There's been some confusion about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman in this culture. Look outside. Look at the riots all around us. It's predominantly young people and especially young men who are struggling, whether because of 3 months of quarantine or because of a cultural issue about masculine identity issues. They don't know what to do. And so when we look at this, and even the topic of liver disease, it's interesting to me because liver disease among women wasn't common, but it's more common now because more women are drinking than they had in the past. And so we're seeing more women having issue with their liver. It's one reason. But what sets us apart? What makes us infectiously attractive to other people? It's our joy. It's our faith-based optimism. And this is a gift. In fact, it's a grace. I think about the 3 theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. It is only through a Christian lifestyle that we can have great faith in our Lord Jesus Christ in a supernatural way, to have faith in what is unseen yet is believed, to have faith in what is not fully understood. The Eucharist is a mystery. The sacrifice of the Mass is a mystery. Yet we forget about this. To have hope in the midst of suffering. Hope is such an incredible virtue to have. It's this balance between humility and magnanimity, as the great philosopher Joseph Pieper once said. He said, hope, if we look at it from a more human perspective, not just a theological perspective, it's being humbled by God, but also living a magnanimous life, and it's a balance between the two. That ultimately our hope is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. Love is this love of self, of neighbor, of God, that goes much deeper than a supernatural, passionate, erotic love, yet unfortunately is the only love that we're taught in this culture. Love is this love that is a gift from God, yet again, modeled to us by Jesus Christ on the cross. You want to know what love is? Look to the cross. It requires you and I taking up our own crosses and being bloody, bruised, and beaten in order to achieve this radical sense of self-giving love in the culture. There's a reason that we make the sign of the cross over and over again over our bodies as Catholics. It's to remind us, yes, of the Trinity as we invoke the names Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But it's also a reminder of our destiny, the cross. There is no escaping the cross. Even at the beginning of time, we read in Genesis that Adam was alone in the garden. He found this profound sense of solitude, this original sense of solitude. And it wasn't until Eve was created that he fully understood himself as a human person. He understood that I am made to be a gift. And Adam and Eve struggled to live this out. And so Christ came and gave us a symbol of this is what humanity is called to. This is the path. This is the human anthropology that I was trying to teach you, even just written into the biological complementarity of your body. You are made to be a gift, a sacrificial gift for another person. And Jesus Christ showed us how to do that virginally as well. You see, we as Christians can show that through our joy of faith-based optimism with that faith, hope, and love, that someone else should and would want to be Catholic. But also, I think that there's a balance that we can strike with regard to our health as well, with regard to our physical, emotional, and psychological health. You see, if you're truly Catholic, there's a level of discipline that is being implemented into your life through prayer, through discipline and development of our character in our emotional life, how we respond emotionally, how we're aware of our very own emotions that we experience day in and day out. There's studies that show that many young people, because of technology now, if they're separated from that technology, they start to feel a little overwhelmed because their emotions they're experiencing that they just don't know how to handle. Yet we can show that emotional virtue and maturity as Catholics. There's also the physical development, essentially, that I think is so important, of being physically fit. You know, we see that there's this increase in people dying, and one of the causes is obesity. I'm not shaming anyone here, but what I am challenging people to is live a life that is attractive. Live a life that gives you energy. Live a life that shows that you honor your body and your soul. We can't just separate body and soul. The two are so important. And so I ask you, ultimately, what sets us apart? Do you inspire others, or do you break them down? Do you inspire and encourage them to grow and change? Because I know that's what I need in my life, and I would argue that's what most of us need, but not just from a secular perspective. We need to bring Christ into the conversation.